Meeting.
Now, the minutes of the last meeting are a little bit redundant because of the wonderful coverage that we have had in the Preservationist, our newsletter. So if you don't want to hear about it again, just put your fingers in your ears. The second membership meeting of 2004 of the Bedford Historical Society was held in the Congregational Church Vestry on March 24 at 7:30 p.m. A social hour with a treasure trove of delectable desserts greeted the 48 members who were in attendance. Following the social time, the meeting was called to order by President Michael Siebert, who thanked the 5 hostesses and bakers for the bounty that preceded. Minutes of the February 25, 2004 meeting were read by the Vice President, Lee Yates, for Secretary Marion Bryan, and were approved as read. Treasurer Helen Nowers gave this financial report of our fund balances as of February 29, 2004. Challenge Fund at Fidelity, $86,153. Matching Fund at Fidelity, $58,274. General Operating Fund at Fidelity, $21,703. Operating Funds at Boston Federal, $5,763. Operating Funds total, $27,466. Total funds, February 29, 2004, $171 at 1,000, one of those numbers, $171,893. Okay, Jeanette Papier informed us of the opportunity to tour the Jacob Russell House in Arlington. For this, she circulated a sign-up sheet. The president told of a letter from the Job Lane House about the room the society cares for, telling not only of the upcoming spring cleaning, but of woodwork and floors needing painting and the precious murals needing some restoration work. Volunteers for the cleaning and painting will be solicited. However, mural care should be performed by a professional. Don asked that volunteers speak with him after the meeting. Cecile Walker told of the program for next month by a lecturer on the work of a 17th and 18th century physician surgeon who will bring his own operating equipment. She thanked Don Corey for his work in preparing for the night program on our own archival possessions. Don said the highlight of the night would be a demonstration of the recently acquired Davis spinning wheel. Mary Hafer gave background information on the Davis family. Guest Elizabeth Stew Malin demonstrated the use of the Davis spinning wheel, which she termed a darling, as she compared it to her spinning wheel, which was later made. Our archivist Susan Bennett gave an update on work she and volunteers are doing on various projects as well as grants she has pursued and won. Miriam Chrisman told about research she has done on the Lane family. John Brown showed several early Bedford maps explaining how they were made, relating them to known landmarks. Due to the lateness of the hour, Don Corey saved his offerings for a later meeting. The meeting was adjourned at 9:30 p.m. Marion Bryan, Secretary.
Thank you. Any
Okay.
corrections, deletions, additions?
Need more than one seat? No, I'm down there. I'm going to go through these two.
All right. Somebody move to accept the minutes. Thank you. Second? All in favor? Great. Treasurer's reports. Helen Nowers.
Bedford Historical Society funds, March 31st, 2004. Fidelity Investments Challenge Fund, $87,517. Matching Fund, $58,374. General Operating Fund, $21,855. Total Fidelity Investments, $167,746. Boston Federal Savings General Operating Fund was $6,911. Total funds, $174,657.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Cecile Walker for doing the hospitality tonight. And Cecile, do you want to talk about the Choral Society?
Lorraine Cobley, you may know her, she's involved in all of the musical things practically in town. And we are having a salute to the Bedford flag, and it's going to be held Sunday afternoon, May 16, costs $1. And it's at 4 o'clock at the Bedford High School. And the tickets, if you want to buy them, you have to make sure you have them. They're available at the New England Nursery, the Stop and Shop, Whole Food Market, or I have them. And the main thing that Lorraine Cobley said is it's nice for you to buy the tickets, but she'd love to see that place filled up. And then one of the things that they mentioned is that, and I have flyers here, I'll put them on the table so you remember. One of the things they said they would like to have from all of the different organizations in town, and we being one historical society, would like to have at least one person, and maybe two, go up at the end of the program and would be standing on the stage with all the other organizations, and that's when we would all sing God Bless America. So we have to decide tonight who might represent the Historical Society. Now, it can be the president, it can be Don, it can be John Brown, but I want you folks to talk about it or whatever, and tell me tonight who wants to do it, okay?
You've been nominated.
Oh, do you have any suggestions, you know? But
Somebody has to sing.
Need to be somebody who can sing.
no, we'll all be singing. No, not you, not just one person singing. We will be up there on the stage as the organizations from the town, and all interested. It's sponsored by the Boston Federal Savings Bank, and is produced by the Bedford Choral Society. And it really should be great. It's at the high school on a Sunday afternoon. No night driving, and it should be good. And if you do want to buy a ticket, I have some, and I can take $1. And I'll put the flyers over there. Now, before we start on our program set up here, Don Corey has something that he was going to do last time, and we didn't get time to do it. So he's going to do it tonight, and we're very glad of that. And you tell us all about it, Don.
It's going to be a 5-minute Bedford, a little history of the former Prescott Dairy. And just part of the point of this is to, again, show how a lot of the information that we have in the Historical Society archives can be used. Also, before I get started, I wanted to just mention, on page 2 of the newsletter, it mentioned proposed deaccessions of a number of books on crocheting and things. These are the books that we're proposing to deaccession. If anybody has any interest, if you think we shouldn't deaccession them, speak up and we'll probably save them. But the directors have approved a deaccessioning of this. We've given public notice, and if anybody wants to speak up and save them, speak up. Otherwise, they'll be available for sale or for donation, 4th of July, Bedford Day, whatever it's going to be. Also on page 2, the commemorative plate of Bedford, Massachusetts, which was just donated by Donna Argon. We have no idea of the history of this plate. If anybody has ever seen one before, we'd be delighted to find out. Donna would probably like to know too. But it's a very nice plate, and it has a lot of the old sites that were in town. It's undated, and anybody that has a clue, please let us know. So, okay, moving on. Prescott Dairy. Screen over now. One of Bedford's. Oh, don't worry, I can aim the other machine here. It was one of Bedford's own local dairies. It was located just to orient you, here's Wilson Park, North Road, Concord Road, Red Barn, and this is a current assessor's map, and this is Dahlia's Restaurant and Bedford Farms Ice Cream. Bedford Farms was a successor to Prescott Dairy. And follow the red marking, which was J.B. Prescott's home, and the dairy outlined in green. We have, and this is a modern current assessor's map, but the society has many wonderful old maps. Well, the way the print is on these, we'll have to move around, but here's the same corner, Wilson Park, but here Concord Road's running this way, Carlisle Road, and at that point, North Road was Bill Ricker Road. And we had the Monroe, Jonas Monroe house. This is where Bedford Motel is now. The house was torn down in the 70s, and this is the old Pollard Tavern. And over here you can see where in 1875, this was still part of Monroe's land. They owned everything back here. This was one of the Lane family estate, and this was a part of a Goodwin estate. And between what we have here in the archives and then doing some other investigations, we can track back. So we know 1875 nothing was going on, but by 1879, a number of us have been going down to the Middlesex Registry of Deeds to get information on a lot of these houses. There's a plaque program, as many of you have probably seen the new plaques going up on a number of the houses. And some of us, John Brown, Bob Selecta, Lee has been down there, Lee Yates, Neil Leary, there may be a few others have been down doing some history on houses so we know construction dates. And we know in 1879, Jonas Monroe sold that parcel that I've outlined in red to J. Bartlett Prescott. So 1879 was when Prescott acquired it, and in 1880 is when the J.B. Prescott Dairy was formed. Now we also have a number of old town directories. This one was 1887 directory, and by then, here we have Prescott, who's a milk dealer on, it changed back to North Avenue at that point, that he was in business as 1887. Then we come up to 1889. Again, there's a series of these maps, and they're really nice town maps. We have some of the whole town. A number of these were just the center village. But as time goes on from the mid-1800s through early 1900s, they have each parcel and they show the individual names of the properties. And so between the deeds and the names here, you can follow. And this probably isn't legible, but here's J. Prescott. This is still Goodwin and Mary Lane's heirs that owned the adjacent property in 1889. Around that time, there was a lot of speculation in land going on in town. And in 1904, one of the more aggressive speculators in land, one Abram English Brown and his wife Sarah, bought up a number of parcels from the heirs of Lane, Mary Lane, and Thomas Goodwin and Mary Lane, and then in turn sold, in 1904, sold the land to J.B. Prescott. And because the land had been spread amongst a lot of heirs, Prescott took the parcel, went into land court, so he got the land registered. So if there were any other heirs around, they couldn't come back later on and claim they had a share of his dairy. So he cleared the title, and that was his land. And by 1906, our map shows in Carlisle, North Road, and Concord Road, and Wilson Park down here. He owned the whole works. This was his house that had shown up on the 1889 map, but now we have some outbuildings behind, and those were the barns where the dairy, where he stored the wagons presumably, and had this creamery. And besides the maps and the directories, we also have some nice photographs. This one is courtesy of John B. Brown. And the house is up here. This is North Road. This is the barn, part of the creamery that was toward Concord Road. And then this is the part that was directly behind the house. And as we track on, this is Dahlia's restaurant. They brought the roof down, but as we go on, we can tell by the style, by the shape and the exact location, the exact size, that building is the basic building for the Dahlias. When you go in on the left-hand side, you go up the stairs, and where the smaller restaurant is, that's all that. The addition where the lower restaurant and down the far end, the Bedford Farms ice cream is, that was added later on. But had a few of the milk wagons. This was probably in the early 20s, John built, because the trolley tracks were still there, and they got hung up shortly thereafter. And again, we have directories. This one happens to be a 1919 directory, and here we still have J. Bartlett, Prescott, selling milk from the North Road. Then we had a disaster. This is an article in January 1930 from Bedford. Okay. Father's tragic death puts the firm under the direction of the daughter. And this is Esther Prescott. And this is an article, by the way, that was donated by one of the Joslins who owned Fitch Tavern before the Breeders. And one of her friends is a descendant of the, if I can get that clear enough for you to read, but I will read it. The tragic accident. Mr. Prescott was in an auto accident Christmas afternoon when returning home from Worcester with two friends. His car skidded in Maynard, went into a fence and then a pond. A blow on the head made Mr. Prescott unconscious. Someone held his head above water until help arrived, but his injuries plus double pneumonia caused his death the next day. And that, again, is part of the collection that comes from little scraps of information from here and there, and we're able to build the interesting and amazing story. After that, there was an attorney, Amos Taylor, who took charge as a trustee, and Bee's dad, Mr. Sims, was hired as a manager there, I believe. After 1930, they continued to expand the business. This is a 1932 addition of land, and this was one of the things that mentioned. They had just added a little piece in back here to square off the lot, but they had this is the creamery. This is the one building that eventually was gone. This is the building which, when you get the same scale, it overlies directly the building where the upper portion of the Dahlia's restaurant is. So we can tell that that's the same building that was built in 1906. So after that, they continued to prosper. They did add, after the war, they used horse carts, I believe, through the war. And sometime during the war, the one building, the barn that had been on this side burned, and that was finally torn down. And when they finally changed over from horses, they bought the land in back here and added garages where they kept the gasoline-driven vehicles. So it was very successful going all the way up into the 70s, but then I think all of the small dairies got beaten up by the big agribusiness companies, and Prescott and as well as the other small dairies were pushed out of business, and this whole parcel was eventually sold to Bill Callahan, and he subdivided it, made it into condominiums, 3 different condominium parcels. And the one parcel that we're tracing that is Dahlia's is the one that's outlined in green. That's one of the units. The house, Bartlett Prescott's house is one, and then the buildings in back are another. And it's obviously no longer a dairy, but has a long and interesting history. This was all prompted because he was interested, Dahlia's was interested in a shingle, so we can say with great authority, well, that was the site of the J. Prescott Dairy going back to 1880, and the building itself was the earliest portions of it go to date back to 1906. So how he's going to handle the plaque, we don't know. But it's a sort of interesting history that you can put together for just about any of these old parcels. And for some of us, we find it pretty fascinating. But it also is just another example of why we're looking for more information. Anything that anybody has, cut out of the newspapers, scrapbooks, whatever. We do always appreciate it. Thank you.
Don has been working, and the Bedford Historical Society has been working so much with the archives that we find all these wonderful, wonderful things. It's good. I'm going to find the,
You want your paperwork?
oh, I didn't bring that. Thank you. Now, next month, Wednesday, May 26th, we'll have our annual potluck dinner. By the way, I still want the directors' meetings to consider a microphone. I'm just wanting that. Anyway, I hope I'm not the only one.
Why don't we let the
who thinks that, right?
executives decide
Oh,
that?
the executives, yes. Wednesday, May 26th is the annual potluck dinner. And what I need is a telephone committee. I'll be one, and I need 4 more. And these 5 people will call all the members to see who's coming, because we have to know in order to set up. And I also will need a committee for help setting up and helping some during the dinner, like pouring coffee. And I'll need somebody to help me set it up the tables for that night. So I'm going to pass this around, and I hope it comes back with just a few names on it, because it would be a big help. And I also want to thank all of you for the cakes and things that we usually have at the meetings, but somehow something got slipped up this time. I think I forgot to ask, and I think Mike forgot to ask, so I'm sorry we didn't have the gourmet like we had once all the time. So I'll pass this around. If you want to do any of that, I really would appreciate it. And I thought I had a pen. Let me see. Here's some pencils. Oh, all right, that's a pencil. That'll do. I'll go find the doctor. Here's a pencil. And if you can't, it's okay, but I hope I'll find out. Very honored tonight. It isn't often I can introduce a doctor. And he's here tonight to explain a lot about the about the medicine and the 18th century way they dealt with illness and the different medicines. Now, I forgot to ask him his background, or I don't know. I usually can say something about him, so you will have to say something about yourself. Edward Paige, who is Dr. Skinner tonight. So I present you with him. Please tell us something about yourself.
Well, thank you. Thank you kindly. Dr. Elisha Skinner,
Excuse me.
born in 1754 in the town of Norton, and as any good citizen at that time, met his expectations by being a member of the town's militia. He was, in 1775, engaged in an apprenticeship, training to become a physician with a Dr. Tiffany in the town of Franklin, Massachusetts. And when the alarm reached the town of Norton that the regulars were out in the countryside, he responded with the other members of the militia to Dedham, and from there was sent to Roxbury to man the trenches to prevent further excursions by the British into the countryside over Roxbury Neck. He served 13 days in those trenches before returning to Norton, put his affairs in order, and returned to enlist in the fledgling Continental Army over in Cambridge. He was enlisted on the rolls as surgeon's mate, and that was in August, he was listed, the date was listed in August of 1775. The following January, in 1776, he was enlisted as the surgeon in Marshall's regiment, which later, as the Continental Army became formalized, became the Massachusetts 10th Regiment of the Continental Line. And Dr. Skinner served with that regiment through the entire war. And at the conclusion, after the victory at Yorktown had in effect ended the war, George Washington was hesitant to disband his army until a peace treaty had been signed, fearing that there may be a reneging on the part of the British. And the army, his regiment, was in garrison in upstate New York. And at that time, Dr. Skinner decided that he had done his duty and resigned his position and took his bounty land. One of the ways to induce people's enlistment in the Continental Army was to offer bounties. And among the bounties was land. And 100 acres of land for somebody who enlisted for the duration of the war was a considerable inducement. And of course, these young men who were enlisting had dreams of, I'm sure, thinking of the land close by. And when they found out the land they were being offered was out in Ohio. But there was also land being offered up in what's now Maine, which was still pretty remote. But for those soldiers from Massachusetts, and in particular, being along the coastline, it was a lot more acceptable. And Dr. Skinner took his bounty land in Brewer, Maine, and spent the rest of his life serving in that community and continued to show his responsibility, his feelings of indebtedness to his fellow man in his service. He was involved in the community, serving, as you might expect, as the health inspector for the community, and he also served as a selectman. And while in the Army, he became very interested and involved in the Masonic movement. And of course, when he went to Brewer, Maine, he wanted to continue in that, and was one of the founding members of a lodge still active there, the Rising Virtue Lodge, and serves as involved in the Masonic order. So truly a gentleman to be respected. And one of the reasons I'm here, and that, like many of most of my fellow reenactors, a strong part of our motivation is to bring people like Dr. Skinner to reality. Too often, I think, we look back on the stories of the men who responded to the alarm on the 19th of April and who served in the Continental Army, and we hear the legends of Valley Forge and the privations of these people, and it almost becomes like legend and semi-fiction. But we'd like to make it clear that these were real people who acted on real convictions and did suffer through a great deal of privation. Now, I served with the reenacting 10th Regiment as the surgeon. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about medicine and what passed for medicine in the 18th century. Early on, I think, to have an understanding, there's a few things to keep in mind. There was no science in the 18th century, or science as we would talk of it, or think of it. They spoke of science. But as simple as coming up with a hypothesis and then coming up with ways of testing your hypothesis and keeping records of what you had done and results never occurred to people in the 18th century. It wasn't until 1730, in regard to medicine, that a physician who was working at the present-day Mass General Hospital, Dr. Wigglesworth, decided that it might be a good idea if they were to write down the symptoms of the patients that they had, what treatments they prescribed, and what the outcomes were, and compare the outcomes for various treatments for similar symptoms. Now, does that seem like something? But that is one of the things you have to understand about how medicine and science existed in the 18th century. A good deal of what passed for medical care in the 18th century was based not on science in the way of testing and proving and using treatments that we had found to be effective, but it was based on philosophy, going all the way back to Aristotle. And Aristotle, in his wisdom, who sat there and did a lot of thinking and decided that everything that existed in the world was made up of 4 atoms, or elements. And these were air, water, fire, and earth. Everything was made from those things. And the alchemists that we hear about in the Middle Ages were still operating on that theory that the perfect balance of those 4 elements produced the perfect material, which was incorruptible gold. So they were trying to combine, or find a way to combine those elements to produce gold. And they were quite certain that there was a way they could do it and gain fabulous wealth. Now, to further build on this, it was decided that the human body and health of the human body depended on corresponding values within the body, which they called humours. And these 4 humours of the body were blood, phlegm, yellow, and black bile. And these elements were also given properties. They were hot or cold, wet or dry. And those transposed into the body. These humours of the body also had those characteristics. So as an example, blood, I think would be obvious to all of us that it would be characterized as hot and wet. So the theory in the 18th century was illness was a result of an imbalance of these humours. So picture, if you will, someone who has a strep infection. One of the symptoms of a severe infection of that sort would be fever. Probably one of the first signs that you would get, and probably one of the most obvious to us. Now think of a person with a fever and their appearance. Their face is kind of wet from the fever, and they're also red-faced. So you look at that person, easy to diagnose. They have an imbalance that's causing this illness, and the imbalance being an excess of blood in the system. So there's obvious treatment there is to remove the excess blood. So if we take a patient and remove 10 to 12 ounces of blood, guess what's going to happen? Any of you have ever gone and donated your blood to the Red Cross? You may know the experience. Sometimes you'll hear about people who pass out. They want you to, after you donated the blood, to sit up for a little while, and then they escort you over to an area to sit down for a while and give you a little nourishment. Don't want you to leave until your body's had a chance to adjust to this. Because if you take 10 to 12 ounces of blood, by reducing the volume of blood in a person's body in a pretty rapid way, you're going to get an immediate drop in the blood pressure. And when you get a drop in the blood pressure, that can cause lightheadedness. But think of this person with the fever now. We take this blood away, and what's going to happen to this person who's kind of agitated and sweaty and irritable a little bit? We take the 10 to 12 ounces of blood out, and all of a sudden their complexion is going to get a little pale, and their blood pressure drops, so they become they want to just lay down and be calm, and they cool down, and their fever drops, and they stop the sweating. Dr. Skinner has succeeded once again. So this was the idea of, gives you some idea of the practice of medicine in the 18th century. Now, I mentioned Dr. Skinner was involved in an apprenticeship. Well over 90% of the physicians practicing in this country at the time of the Revolution were trained through apprenticeships. There was one medical school in this country at that time, and it was attached to a part of what is now the University of Pennsylvania. But there was little gain in the training of a physician in the 18th century, a little difference between those trained at a university and those trained through an apprenticeship. The major differences, two major differences. One is generally those trained at a university had a better knowledge and understanding of anatomy, such as it was in the 18th century. They had the opportunity to dissect cadavers, and they had benefit of some of the textbooks that had been prepared in Europe through long experience with dissecting cadavers. And the other major gain was that these people were more literate, better writers. They knew how to write down and explain their experiences and so on. But as terms of coming to your bedside and dealing with your illness, many times the physicians who had been trained to an apprenticeship were getting a better experience. Even coming up into the modern day, it wasn't until the early part of the 20th century that in the training of physicians that went into hospitals and dealt with patients. There were many doctors graduated from medical school who had never dealt with a patient in the early part of the 20th century. So a lot of things that we assume about medicine from our experience today is, it doesn't coincide with reality. And things that seem so obvious to us today. But if you think about it, there was a little prejudice that grew there about these apprenticeship-trained physicians and the university-trained physicians as to, well, dealing with patients was the way the apprenticeship did it. We are of the university, and we are doing this from an intellectual approach. So there was a little bit of that went into the training of physicians. But to get back to the 20th century, to the 18th century, excuse me, two other very important things to understand about medicine in that time. This was well before anyone had any concept or idea of the cause of infection. Bacteria, microorganisms, unknown. In fact, it was widely taught that nothing smaller than a flea could cause any effect on the human body. People were just beginning to look through microscopes and begin to look at all kinds of materials. And had somebody proposed at that time that some of these little squiggly things that they were looking at could possibly have any detrimental effect on a human body, they would have been thought a fool and ridiculed. So it took quite a while to determine the cause of infection. So sanitation, that seems so elemental to our, even the youngest child learns about washing hands and caring for scratches and the like. In the 18th century, not a concern. When you see dramatic presentations where they will take their knife before doing surgery and pour alcohol on it or run it through a flame, why would they do that? They had no concept that there was anything. They could look at it and see that it was clean. Why would they have to do that? They didn't know about bacteria or microorganisms. And the same thing with the handling of food. There was no understanding of microorganisms in there. If the food tasted all right, then you could eat it. So that was one of the major elements to consider. The other was there was no anesthesia. And alleviating pain was not a high priority, believe it or not. Now, if you think about surgery, and there was obviously surgery that needed to be done in the 18th century. There was no anesthesia. Now, again, going back to a dramatic presentation, you look at a John Wayne movie and they're, well, we gotta get that bullet out. Drink this bottle of whiskey and then we'll go to work. Well, the reality is alcohol. One of the side effects of alcohol, if you think of a person who's imbibed maybe a little too much, think of their appearance. They get kind of red-faced, the old cartoon of the drunk with the big red shiny nose and so on. One of the effects of alcohol on the human body is to dilate the blood vessels. So think about doing surgery with dilated blood vessels, the problems that creates. Probably a lot of people here who, like myself, swallow an aspirin every day. And you get a little nick or a cut, and it bleeds and bleeds and bleeds, and you have to go to work to slow it down because the aspirin affects coagulation and so on. So contemplate even something like removing a tooth. Somebody's got a lot of alcohol in their system, they're going to be bleeding. So that's not a good idea. They understood that. And secondarily to it all, or primarily to it all, even if you take a person and feed them so much alcohol that they pass out, become unconscious, the alcohol does not affect the part of your brain that receives the input of pain. Pain is such a primitive, primary factor in your survival that in the hierarchy of your brain, the reception of pain is very important. Because, think about it, without pain, you could put your hand on a hot stove and not realize it till you smell the burning flesh, unless you're sensitive to pain. And so many other things that you could severely injure yourself if you don't perceive pain. So now you picture you've got this person who's overdosed on alcohol, and then you're going trying to do surgery. As soon as you touch them with your knife, they're going to be thrashing around for the pain. Now, if you're conscious and you understand that I'm going to be doing this to try and alleviate your pain or save your life, you'll try as best you can to cooperate with me. May not be easy, but you will. But the person who's unconscious is just going to, their unconscious is going to take over and they're going to thrash. It's going to be all the more difficult to control them and to do the surgery. Narcotics, the same way. Narcotics, and they had a very powerful narcotic that was used. It was called laudanum, a tincture of opium. Opium dissolved in alcohol. And it was, as you could imagine, a very powerful narcotic. But one, it too dilates blood vessels and also doesn't affect the part of your brain that perceives pain. It took a long time to discover an agent that would, number one, render a person unconscious, and number two, shut down the perception of pain. And to give you some other idea, there was a great influence of religion and religious belief that was involved with pain. Anyone familiar with the story of Adam and Eve knows that one of the punishments imposed by the Lord on Adam and Eve when they were sent from the garden was, women shall bear their children in pain, which was interpolated to mean all pain was the will of God inflicted on humanity as a punishment for the sin of Adam and Eve. So it was dealt with by people as understanding that they had been chosen, it was the will of the Lord that they should endure this pain, whether it was a woman who was going into labor to deliver a child, or whether it was somebody that was going to have a tumor removed or an arm or a leg amputated. They considered that they were in a reverent way submitting themselves to the will of God. You think that took the pain away? No, it didn't. But it gave them a little way of dealing with why they were going to have to endure this. Whole surgery, yes, laudanum was used and so on, but the actual surgeries were done without anesthesia. Something incomprehensible to us now. The idea of infections, even in the preeminent medical school in the world in the 18th century, and that was the University of Edinburgh, they taught that there were 4 stages of healing of every wound. First, the wound would become red, it would become warm, it would swell, and then the 4th and final stage would be the appearance of laudable pus. If you took a youngster, even youngsters today learn very early and very soon that if a scratch or a bruise starts getting red and puffy, that something's wrong. We understand the process of infection, what's going on. If you have the appearance of pus, you know that this wound has become infected, and that's a serious thing. Even the smallest wounds becoming infection can have very, very major implications. But in the 18th century and prior and even after, they didn't understand that, and the way they dealt with it was every wound they saw, because of their lack of understanding, became infected. And they saw every wound go through those 4 stages. And if they were fortunate, that infection would ooze to the outside. But if perchance it became bloodborne, that's even today, blood infection can be a very serious challenge to deal with. Because once that infection gets into your bloodstream and gets into the lymph glands, it's very hard to overcome. So many people in the 18th century died of what we would call minor injuries, because they became infected, and to their misfortune, these infections fulminated and their body was not able to overcome it. So though that kind of sets the scene for you a little bit. So let's look at some of these things, and we'll get ready to treat some of the problems. No, I won't ask for volunteers. Well, first of all, with a fine suit of clothes on, I certainly wouldn't want to mess them up, so Dr. Skinner needs a good apron to protect his clothes. Now, a good apron, we certainly wouldn't want a linen apron because this splattering blood could leach right through that, so I want a nice leather apron that's going to keep that blood off my clothing. The other thing is, you notice that I'm tying it in the front. The tails are long enough to come around from the back and tie in the front. Now this is something that's particularly for women. One of the second leading cause of death of women in the 18th century.
Puerperal fever?
That would have been first. Childbirth. Fire. If you think of the clothing style of 18th century women, they wore long petticoats and aprons. And if you are tending to your responsibilities, keeping the home fires burning, cooking, you're at an open hearth. There's candles in the house, all of these things, and a woman bending over to work, quite often what would happen is that their aprons or petticoats would catch fire. So they always kept them tied in the front. So if you see anybody representing an 18th century person who has on an apron or a petticoat that isn't tied in the front, they're not representing it correctly, because they always did that so that you could quickly get that untied and get that burning clothing away from it. So now I'm ready to do surgery. Now, let's start with some another thing. Physicians in the 18th century served, well, 4 functions. They were physicians, surgeons, dentists, and pharmacists. They served all of those things. Now, there were apothecary shops around, but you found mostly those shops, those kind of shops, the drug shops, apothecary shops, were in the urban areas. If you were in Bedford in the 18th century, not likely, it's possible there might have been an apothecary shop, but more than likely, because it was one of the most productive profit centers for 18th century physicians, was providing medicine. And there was also another phenomenon of the 18th century in that among apothecaries and physicians, the compound of their medications, they kept a secret. And one of the reasons Latin was used so much in medicine was to keep people, the ordinary person, from understanding what it was they were ingesting. So that was a major function. And to that end, Dr. Skinner would have had his mortar and pestle and a balance scale to compound his medicine, and to probably in his home he would also have had a still for distilling medicine, and it was a very complex procedure that they followed through. But you're probably all familiar with how a balance scale works. You put a little weight on one side, and then you put in your ingredients or whatever it is that you want on the opposite side until the balance scale centers. So if you want a gram of something, we'll put a gram weight over here, and then we'll add our ingredients until we get a balance. Now, some of the medications that were used in the 18th century and beforehand were very toxic. But in small doses, they could be therapeutic. So he had to compound these things very carefully. Now, the very smallest weight, the lightest weights that were used were called scruples. Now, think of the term we use about somebody who's unethical or conducting themselves or their business unethically. They've lost their scruples. So if this person compounding medicine didn't have their scruples to weigh these things out very carefully and were compounding medicine without scruples, they could be killing people or making them very ill. So it's one of the terms that grows out of the practice of medicine at that time. But as I said, along with the apothecary or pharmacy, Dr. Skinner was also the dentist. And in the 18th century, people didn't practice prophylactic care of their teeth because, once again, they weren't understanding of the cause of infection. And so in the 18th century, if you lived long enough, you outlived your teeth. Because when a tooth became, or even today, if a tooth becomes infected, and the infection begins to eat away at the tooth, and you go to the dentist is going to, after he anesthetizes you, going to crank up his drill and clean that out. And has knowledge, and they even have dyes now that can be applied to the tooth to show them if they've cleaned out all the infected material. And then once that's done, today, they're getting beyond even using metal compounds. There's plastic compounds that are put in place and treated with ultraviolet light to get a chemical reaction and create a very strong bond. But the 18th century, they didn't have that kind of mechanism. Now, there were people that created little instruments to go to work and try and clean out the infection. And what they did when they thought they had it cleaned out enough was to use gold, silver, or lead foil and try as best they could to pack that tightly into the cavity that had been created. Now, they were ineffective, first of all, in removing all of the infected material. So that infection was going to continue to grow. But they had slowed it down. But even the best compacting of that foil couldn't stand up to a person chewing. So those little things would pop out, and the infection goes on. And it gets to the point where it becomes painful, and then it gets painful to distraction, and it may even start abscesses or other problems. So they knew the only answer was to get rid of the tooth. So in the 18th century, that was accomplished with a device called a tooth key. Now, if you say a person's having a tooth removed, what's the common expression? You're going to have your tooth pulled. Not the way a tooth is removed. It isn't a matter of yanking it out. Tooth is rock free of its attachment to the gum in the jaw and withdrawn. It's never yanked out. If you went to your dentist today, probably you'd have to go to an oral surgeon to see the equipment that's used. It varies depending on where the tooth is located, but it's made to, this is what happens, and then once it's freed, it's pulled, it's out. Tooth key was a little more primitive. It had this little movable gadget. Now you got to remember, again, keep in mind, we're not anesthetizing anyone here. You might have a drink to fortify yourself beforehand or calm a person down. But this little movable part has serrations, little teeth to it. And it gets its name as a key is inserted in the lock and then turned. Well, the tooth key is inserted between your cheek and your gum till you get to the offending tooth. And then, like key, it's turned. And as it turns, it takes hold of that tooth. And the twisting motion is what rocks the tooth free, and out comes the offending tooth. Now, as I mentioned, people generally waited around until they just couldn't stand the pain. And in many cases, that meant that the crown of the tooth was compromised to the point that sometimes the crown would break off and not all of the root would come along with it. So what's the problem there? Well, the problem is that if that's left behind, it's going to become infected in the gum, create a big abscess, which not only is severely painful, but is dangerous as far as spreading infection. So they understood the process from experience. So they had this handy little tool called a goat's foot elevator. Now, again, if you went to see your oral surgeon or your local dentist and looked over his extraction kit, you'd find a very similar tool there. Of course, it wouldn't have a wooden handle, but that is used to go and to pry out any pieces of the root that have been left behind. Now, as I say, in the 18th century, if you lived long enough, most everyone outgrew their teeth or outlived their teeth. And I'll give you as an illustration of that, some of you may have read the McCullough biography of John Adams. And in that book, Mr. McCullough has included copies of a series of portraits that were made of John Adams through his life, starting shortly after he was married when he was a young man in his 20s, all the way up to the last portrait that was made of him when he was either 90 or 91 years old. Now, in the 18th century, people looked pretty good in their portraits because you would hire somebody to do your portrait, and you'd give him a little upfront money. And he wasn't going to collect his full fee until I had seen and approved of that portrait. So my crooked nose and crossed eyes and some of these other things would obviously be fudged with. And we also have the impression of 18th century people of being very stern and dour, because none of them are smiling in their portrait. The reason being, their teeth weren't very good looking, and many of them are missing. So they sat there with their mouth closed. Some of them had the Mona Lisa type smile to them, but they weren't smiling the way people are in their portraits today, because they had poor teeth. And that last portrait of John Adams, it's very evident. Of course, he was a very old man, and he looks like an old man, and it's very clear in that portrait that the gentleman had no teeth left. And it's documented because he wrote extensively about he lost another tooth, and he lost another tooth. So it went on, and like all of the other people of his era, all the teeth were gone because they couldn't care for them. And on that vein, the legend of George Washington with wooden teeth. No. Anybody's going to the expense of getting a set of false teeth made, they're not going to use wood. They used animal teeth, animal bones, ivory to fashion and shape teeth in people's mouths. And George Washington had a number of sets, and they all had either ivory or bone or whatever for the teeth. But of course, they didn't have the kind of materials or the keys for something like that. Dentures is to get them to fit on securely and snugly onto the gums. They didn't have the ability to do that. So they could make up these teeth, but to keep them from clattering and chattering in there, they made up a spring arrangement that went into the back where the teeth joined to keep them forced up against the gums. And so you had to use your jaw to overcome the spring to do that. And if one of the things about George Washington was he was very, very reluctant to speak in public, and he didn't give long speeches, and that was because it was very difficult to speak with those kinds of teeth in your mouth, and he didn't want to appear without his teeth, and so on. So there were probably many people. One other last thing about dentistry in the 18th century, they were doing dental implants in the 18th century. If you were well enough off and you had a tooth that you were going to lose, you could put an ad in the paper that you were looking to buy a tooth. So if you were hard up for money, you could get down to the local dentist and he would inspect and say, yeah, that tooth is good. So you show up and the purchaser shows up. So out comes the purchaser's diseased tooth. Out comes the good tooth, and we stick that back into the socket. And they had about a 50-50 success rate doing that. I don't know how long they lasted, but they did have some success in replacing teeth like that. I'm sure a great deal of it had to do with how well it fit and so on. how much disease there might have been, the condition of the gums, and, a whole array of things. But they did do it. It was something that they did in the 18th century. Now, we talked about bloodletting and as it being a common thing. There were a lot of, almost anything that went wrong in the 18th century, they thought a good bloodletting helped. One of the other things that went on in the 18th century, thinking about imbalances and so on, there was people looked at things and started surmising women had an advantage because they were periodically got rid of excess blood, but men had no such mechanism. So it was considered in many cases a good prophylactic thing for men to go and have a periodic bloodletting. And usually that was done with a method called cupping. Now, this involves a little bit of physics. Usually, if they were cupping just to remove some blood, well, the mechanism all around for cupping would be to take this and put it into a bucket, a container of water that was hot, and heat this cup up as hot as you could get it so that it wasn't going to burn the skin when you put it on. And if it was some guy coming to have a periodic prophylactic bloodletting, would apply it onto his back. You put it on, it's got a little knob so you can use your finger to hold that tightly against the skin. Now, this is where the physics comes in. Once you've done that, you form a little seal. Now, this warm cup now contains warm, heated air. Now, air that's warm and heated expands, right? So we have expanded air that we trap in here. Now, as this glass cools, what do you suppose happens to the air? It contracts. So this contracting air now produces a vacuum of sorts underneath the cup, and now you withdraw it, and you have this bright ring of blood that you have, by the vacuum, drawn to the surface, or these little capillaries on the surface that you've fractured. So you have that blood there. So we have two choices. You could take your scalpel, in the case of if you're just doing it at home, any knife, and you just make a few slits in that area and let it bleed. If you were well enough off, you could go into a highly mechanized system. This is called a scarificator. And as you can see, I hope, there's a little triangular blade here. And this is a little spring-loaded device. And now the mechanism is set. And you can see that this is flat, so it can be placed up against the skin, and on the side is the trigger. And when we pull the trigger to press it, the little blade comes down, and just like that. And just like when you go, you're going to have a blood sample drawn, they look at your finger and they put the little thing that's going to spring it, and you don't even feel it. Well, that's the way scarificators work. Now, this is a single blade scarificator, and I've seen them with as many as 13 blades in them. So that was really high tech. And believe it or not, I've also seen pictures of people, the pictures I've seen of people in the Middle East who still have belief that this is a good prophylactic thing to do, to go and get cupped and bled on a periodic basis for their health and well-being. The more common thing, and of course, another thing I should mention, if you lived in Bedford or maybe further out into the countryside, just about every household had a little catechism type book like this. This one is called Every Man His Own Doctor, or The Poor Planter's Physician. And this just gives you a listing of symptoms. And if you have this symptom, here is how to treat it. And a very large percentage of them would involve letting blood of various amounts. But just to give you an idea of some of the efficacy of some of these things, one of my favorites in here is if you have a film over the eye. Now think of what would be described as a film over the eye today. A cataract, yeah. So guess what this author suggests as a treatment for this film over the eye? Suction cup. No, you're to go and find some human dung, preferably of a yellowish tinge, and dry it on a rock, pulverize it, and then with a goose quill, blow it into the offending eye. That was this gentleman's suggestion of how to treat it. I should say that in the 18th century they did treat cataracts and treat them the way they would be done today by removing them. And what they used is a thorn as an instrument to go around and to lift that cataract off the eye. So they had some success if they weren't affecting the eye in the process of doing it. You know, we get the impression of the 18th century as people not living very long lives, not having a great life expectancy. If you read the statistics, 45, 50 years of age. But as the saying goes about statistics, lie and liars use statistics and so on. Well, what that represents is an average. Many, many children died in infancy and in their early years. But many people lived long lives. The aforementioned John Adams lived into his 90s. Benjamin Franklin into his 80s. Jefferson into his 80s. George Washington just shy of his 80s. It's just a matter of, when you're born, what's in your genes. You have a strong constitution and a healthy immune system, because you're going to have to endure infections. Whether it's scarlet fever or whooping cough or whatever these childhood diseases, you are going to get infections. And if you had a strong constitution and good immune system, you could overcome the infections. But if you didn't, succumbed as a young child. Even if you had this strong constitution and good immune system, you might just be getting over diphtheria and get hit with chicken pox when your body's immune system is now depleted. There's nothing to help fight the infection but your own body. And so this child, through misfortune, is lost. And you go in the old burial grounds and you'll see wife number 1 and 2, sometimes 3, and you see the list of children, died in the first year, second, third year. And this is why the statistics show that people didn't live a long life. And of course, if you were a working man, a house builder or a cattle drover, the chances of physical injury were great. And the chances of getting cuts and bruises or having an ox step on your foot and crush it or something like that, for people who were out working, there was more chances of injuries leading to early or premature death. Final bloodletting thing that everybody thinks about in the 18th century, I think, is leeches. Leeches, very specialized creatures, and they had very specialized uses. And we'll say, like Dr. Skinner, the regiment arrives in Bedford. They've been marching all the way from New York, and they arrive here in Bedford, and they camp out for the evening. And the captain says, all right, half the men have the night off, but you have to report for duty at 8 o'clock the next morning. So where do you suppose that those soldiers are going to head for the evening? The tavern. You mean they wouldn't go to the library? Close to the library. And what are they looking for at the tavern, do you suppose? This lady's cutting right to it, right off. They're looking for something to drink, a little something to eat, but they're looking for the good-looking women. So all these soldiers suddenly arrive in town, and there may not be enough women around. So sometimes at the end of the evening, after they've had a little to drink and eat and deciding it's who's going to get to take her home, they may end up out behind the tavern deciding that way. So the next morning, the poor guy who didn't get to take her home shows up with his eye all swollen out, black and closed up. So the captain's not too happy, because how can you aim a musket with your eye all swollen shut? Go see Dr. Skinner. So we could take and slit it with a scalpel and drain it, but of course that's going to leave this wound behind. Or if I'm fortunate enough and I have leeches available to me, I can get out a leech and apply the leech. Now a leech, if you're not aware, is a very special kind of worm. There are in the world dozens and dozens of species of leeches. The most sought after for medical purposes comes from England. Peru leeches. And what makes them special is leeches live on blood. They're very specialized. They've adapted through hundreds, thousands of years. And on each end, they have kind of like a mouth piece. One end is the end that they use to attach themselves to their host. And you say, well, boy, if a leech tried to get on me, I'd swipe it right off. It wouldn't have a chance. But if anybody ever did any traipsing around in a swampy, jungly area, you realize it isn't that simple. Because obviously the leeches are going to be successful if that's the case. So they have been adapted so that these teeth in there, like a ring of triangular teeth, when they bite in, they inject an anesthesia that numbs the area. So in they go, you don't feel a thing. And the leech has himself a good grasp. Once he has the grasp, then the other end, the mouth end, with similar set of teeth, latches on, and he's ready to feed. In order to facilitate this, not only is it injecting anesthesia, but he's also injecting a very powerful anticoagulant, so that he's going to be able to get a good flow of blood. And the leech will expand 7 to 8 times its hungry size to where it's satiated and it drops off. And that would take maybe 15 to 20 minutes for him to get to that point. Why this leech is so sought after is that anticoagulant that is injected will keep that little puncture wounds, those little circular set of puncture wounds, open and bleeding and draining for up to 12 hours after he lets loose. So you can imagine this swollen up eye, which is an accumulation of fluid and blood from broken capillaries and so on in the area, that drains out pretty well. And so over a course of a few hours, this fellow who had his eye all swollen shut is now going to be in pretty good shape. They were also used very effectively to treat hemorrhoids. Well, you know, think of it, it's painless and it's effective. Enough said. Today, in modern medicine, leeches play a very important key role. We think of that as being a kind of a crude way of treating, but they play a very important role in plastic and reconstructive surgery. You read occasionally, fortunately not that often, and now it's become so commonplace you read even less about it, of reattaching fingers or even hands and so on that have been accidentally lost. Also, people, particularly people who've been in car wrecks or sometimes industrial accident, where you might have a great chunk of your forehead or cheek torn. Getting the process of suturing this back in place, or of reattaching muscles and tendons and so on, that was technology that was available for many years. But it wasn't until the advent of microsurgery, where veins and arteries could be reattached, that there was any hope of getting a successful reattachment of a lost digit or hand. And one of the problems in that is, even though you can suture these arteries and veins together, the reestablishing of arterial circulation is more easily accomplished, because you have the pressure of the heartbeat behind it. The venous circulation, however, is much more difficult to reestablish. And as a result, quite often in this attempted reattachment, whether it's a finger or a piece of skin, the blood begins to pool up in there. Now, there's two problems with that. One, this pooled blood is very painful, causes swelling and pain, but more importantly, it becomes a source of infection. This is where the leech comes in. If you attach a leech, the leech is going to draw off that pooled up blood. And with that anticoagulant that's injected in there, it's going to keep that open so that the excess blood can be drained. But it also helps promote the growth of venous circulation. So they play a very important role, and that anticoagulant that they produce has been very, very difficult to reproduce synthetically. So not only is the anticoagulant necessary, but their unique way of injecting it is also very helpful in that process. And not to take too much more of your time, but I think when you think of a military surgeon in the 18th century, you think of gunshot wounds and treating gunshot wounds and why so many amputations. Well, these are typical bullets that a musket would fire. Now, we tend to take a look and we see these, the illustrations of these 18th century armies in their bright uniforms coming onto a field, marching ever closer to each other before they fired. Colonel Prescott of Bunker Hill said, "Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes or the buttons on their coats." And put the ramrod 40 yards in front of the fort as don't fire till they get there. So people sometimes assume that means that muskets weren't very lethal. So you had to get real close to do any damage. But that's not the case. And as you feel those bullets, pure lead, those are 75 caliber, which is what the British GI musket of the day, a Brown Bess, fired. They weigh a little over an ounce. And just think if somebody threw that at you. Now, being fired at you, it's, believe me, well beyond 40 yards, it's deadly. The problem is, to facilitate loading, these were muzzle loaders, had to be loaded, the powder and the bullet had to be loaded down through the barrel. And to facilitate that, or to speed it up, they used a round ball. They knew about how to make rifles, but rifles took a very long time to load, and they weren't very effective in a combat situation. So, the round ball, a smooth tube, that ball is coming out of the tube spinning. It will travel in the direction it's pointed out to about maybe 50 yards before it loses enough velocity so that the spin is going to cause it to start curving. Every time it comes out of the barrel, it's spinning a little differently. So you can't compensate and say, well, I'll aim over here to hit the target over there. It's not possible to do that. So if you have two people standing in opposite end zones on a football field firing smoothbore muskets at each other, it would be an indeed unlucky person who got hit by a bullet that was aimed at him as a result. So that's why they closed it tight. But you can imagine when one of those bullets struck home, the kind of damage that it did. Now we'll send a couple of bullets that have impacted. And I want you to note not only the fact that they're very distorted, but also the volume. is not the same. They've lost volume. And where did that lead go to? Well, because it's soft, pure lead, as soon as it hits impacts on your flesh, and consider the fact that it's, in most cases, it's penetrating also through layers of clothing, it flattens out. And as it flattens out, little fragments of that bullet break off. So you've got fragments of lead that are breaking off from the path of this bullet. And if the bullet also happens to strike a bone, it causes a shattering effect, and you've got fragments of bone through the tissue. The first thing Dr. Skinner is going to do when a patient gets delivered to him, if this patient had a wound in his arm, the first thing I want to do is check to see whether he has a pulse. You've got a pulse. A lack of pulse, whether it's in the arm or a leg, is an indication that these fragments have cut through enough of the arteries that are supplying blood below the wound that there's no circulation there. Effectively, the circulation is lost. Now, they knew from experience that without circulation, the flesh is going to die. It produces gangrene, which is progressive. It won't happen immediately, but it happens inevitably. They could clean the wound, remove fragments. They had a probe, the round end, that they could follow the path of the bullet to find the bullet. They had bullet forceps with little pockets in the end to try and extract the bullet if it was beyond the reach of their finger. They had a little eye like on a needle. They could put some fabric in there and insert that into the wound to try and clean out fragments. But if that circulation was damaged, there's going to be no hope of that limb surviving. So the answer was amputation. The only thing that they could do to prevent gangrene from eventually killing the person altogether, let alone losing the leg. So amputation was the answer. And thinking of a person now going to have to undergo amputation without anesthesia is one of the reasons that Dr. Skinner's hospital was always located remotely from the camp, because they didn't want to discourage the morale of the rest of the soldiers by listening to, witnessing the goings-on. And after a conflict where there were soldiers that had to be treated, one of the dreaded duties was being sent to the hospital to assist Dr. Skinner. And the assistance, for the most part, would involve holding the person in place and also holding the limb that was to be removed steady so the doctor could work. First step, applying a tourniquet above the wound to staunch the flow of blood. Capital knife, which is used to cut through the muscle and flesh down to the bone. It's made to facilitate quick action, quick work. In the 18th century, their motto was, a good surgeon is a quick surgeon. This person is in shock from the wound to begin with, and they're going to further be in shock from the trauma of the surgery. So they quickly cut, they make it in kind of an S-shaped cut so that the ends can be closed like the cover on a baseball, so that they kind of overlap. Once the flesh and muscle's been cut through, the next step is to force that flesh and muscle back away from the wound as far as possible up towards the tourniquet. And then the bone is cut off as close to that flesh as possible. So that once you've cut through the bone, now you can slide that flesh and muscle tissue back down over the end of the bone so that you don't have a piece of bone protruding out of the end. That's going to cover it over. Now, one last thing before suturing, to give you another feel for 18th century medicine. Before suturing that up, it was common practice to pack that stump with salt. Why would you imagine Dr. Skinner, who was here to help to relieve injury and is a fellow soldier, would pack salt into that wound?
Yes.
Yeah. But they didn't know about antiseptics. Right. When, in the 18th century, if you had a piece of meat or fish that you wanted to preserve, you didn't have ice or refrigeration, so they salted things. Salt beef, salt pork, salt fish. One of the big exports from New England back to Europe was salt corn. So they interpolated, well, if salt preserves meat, we'll put it in there and that will help heal up this wound, preserve that flesh. What they didn't understand was it is an antiseptic. Salt in solution is antiseptic. And this is why if you head down to the ocean and to go for a swim and you have some kind of a cut or abrasion or something and you've been swimming around in the ocean for a while and you come out and you look at that kind of wound, you'll see that it's all nice and clean and promoting healing there because of the antiseptic treatment that you've given it in there. Now, they didn't know the cause of bacteria and infection, but what they were doing was killing off the bacteria and organisms so that those amputations were very successful. How they came to it, it's not all written down, but speculation goes to, you know that flogging was common punishment in 18th century and before. We think of it on ships, but it was common punishment in civilian life and in the Army as well as the Navy. On a ship, handling all those sails on a ship took a lot of men. So captain didn't flog one of his men lightly. He needed that man's service. So he didn't want him out of service. But he had to maintain discipline, so they would flog. So what they would do is dredge up a bucket of water. So they're not going to use fresh water. They're going to dredge up a bucket of salt water and throw it on after the flogging to clean it off. And they discovered that these sailors that had been flogged and their backs washed with salt water healed up much quicker than people who were flogged without the salt water. You know, if you lived in Bedford and you were out making eyes at somebody's wife and got flogged a few times, and you had the town water thrown on your back, you could get infected wounds and so on. But when they understood the value of salt, throw a handful of salt on the back of the person. We use that term, throwing salt into the wound, as a way of an expression that would indicate you're piling on. You're adding insult to injury. Because it is painful. Salt into an open wound stings because of the action that it's creating. But in reality, you're doing somebody a favor. You're really treating them well to put salt on their wound. One last little bit of surgery that was fairly common in the 18th century was trephining. Now, if you think about transportation, people, if you were fortunate enough to have a horse or a wagon, and you're riding on a horse, all the roads, of course, were not paved. And especially this time of year in the springtime, riding on roads that were maybe not the main road, but a secondary road, the action of the frost through the winter might have pushed some big stones to the surface, and you're riding your wagon down there and it hits a stone, kabump, and the person gets bounced off the wagon. You land on the ground and bump your head. Or your horse gets startled and you get thrown off and you bump your head. Or if it's a soldier with a single shot musket, many of the battles ended up in hand to hand. And if you look at an 18th century musket, the butt plate, rather than being something rubbery or soft to absorb the recoil in the 18th century, it was a hard piece of brass or steel because it was a weapon. So head trauma was fairly common in the 18th century. If you injure your head, if you bump your head hard enough, you might get an egg growing on the outside. It can also jar your brain against the inside of your skull, which is there to protect it, but that injury, that thump can be hard enough to bruise your brain. Cause swelling, can break blood vessels that begin to bleed in there. If you, especially if you're hit with a musket butt, or somebody hits you with an object, you can get a fracture. Or even worse, a depressed fracture where the skull bone is broken and depressed down. All of these things create pressure on the brain, intracranial pressure. And intracranial pressure, depending on what part of the brain, causes immediate symptoms that are easily observed. You may lose your vision, your speech, your strength on one part of your body. Now, in the 18th century, they recognized those things went along with head injury. And when those symptoms occurred, they knew how to relieve them. And that was with your trephine saw. First off, we find the area of the injury, and it's probably pretty easy to find because there'd be a bump there and maybe even it's cut a little bit. So we take a razor and shave off the hair all around that area. Now, once we have the scalp exposed, we need to cut an incision through the scalp down so that we've exposed the area where the injury is. And one of my assistants will use the retractors to open up that incision so that now we've exposed the skull. Now the trephine saw has a point to create a center point. Push that down onto the skull, and then with gentle pressure and turning, the teeth of the saw will gradually cut through and eventually cut through the skull and pop out a disc of the skull. Now, once that opening is created, the blood and the fluid that has collected in there, creating the pressure, is relieved. And almost immediately, the symptoms, the vision, hearing, or speech problems, whatever it is, are almost immediately relieved. Now, that opening will drain. There'll be an immediate gush of, depending on how much pressure there is, but there will be drainage for a while afterwards. So Dr. Skinner would take some lint, as they call it, just torn apart, old worn linen, and pack that into the opening to absorb drainage, and we'll send the soldier back to his tent with a dose bottle of laudanum. And the prescription is you're to lie in your bed quietly on a low diet. Low diet being clear liquids and broth, and a dose, a sip of laudanum from time to time to keep you calm and at ease. It's called the dose bottle because it's enough and with a little lip on it so that you can sip out of it. And it aided in keeping the person calm and quiet in bed. Unfortunately, in laudanum is a highly addictive narcotic. And there were many people in the 18th century, right through into the 19th century, that became addicted to laudanum. So it's, you know, there's good news, bad news, as there is with many things. After the drainage ceases, we have to suture that incision together. Any of you had stitches? I mean, 20th century now, surgery, a lot of wounds are closed with metal staples. But there's still suturing. Curved needle. You've got this opening that we have to bring the edges, approximate the edges. And the way it's done is with the curved needle, you poke this needle with the ligature attached through the eye down on one side, away from the edge of the wound that you want to close, and it's curved so that once you get it through the skin, you turn it and poke it up through the skin on the opposite side, and then draw it through, and now you have a ligature down underneath the wound. And now it's just a matter of tying it off on top, not real tight, but just tight enough to keep those edges closely aligned. And surgery accomplished. There was, I've seen a statistic about a 75% success rate in trephine surgery. If you were a person of means, you might insist that I place a gold or silver coin over the opening. But truth is, that was superfluous and unnecessary. The hole itself, depending on what your age is, if you're a young person whose bones are not hardened off and finished growing, there'll probably be a process where that opening will be closed up almost completely. If you're in my age bracket, the edges probably would smooth off a little bit, and that's about it. But consider that you're cutting an opening that's maybe 3/4 of an inch in diameter. The skull itself is pretty thick. The scalp that covers it is pretty thick, all intended for the very important purpose of protecting your brain. And the hair that grows on your head is also there to add a layer of protection. So after that surgery, the wound heals up, you got that scalp over there, you got the hair growing back over there, and you'd have to feel around to find that opening. A little infant baby with that little incomplete skull, so that it can grow and expand, has very thin scalp. But you still have to feel around a bit to find that, quote, soft spot. Think of an adult person, and you'd be hard pressed to find it. In the case of a depressed fracture, the hole is made away from it into solid enough area, and then these curved handles are there so that that could be introduced through that opening to get over and reach underneath these depressed bones and lift them up into place. So those are some of the lovely things of the 18th century. And I just want to leave you with one remedy from the 18th century that I will guarantee that every one of you can use, and I guarantee it to be 100% effective. Is anyone here ever